So let me introduce the topic, and this is Damon Poole, founder and CEO of Synergia. We run this webinar these webinar series on a monthly basis. So today's topic is Scrum and Kanban. You guys may have heard of Kanban. Many of you I know are practitioners of various agile techniques in your real world. And Kanban is one of the more recent ones to join the mainstream. And this is a very good, interesting evolution in the continuation of agile practices. And we are delighted to have Damon Poole introduce this topic and really show how to mix and match Scrum and Kanban to really apply it in your specific, unique software development situations. So let me introduce Damon. Damon is a CTO and founder of AccuRev, and he's a regular presenter at Agile Conference. In fact, his last presentation on this topic was standing room only at the last Agile World Conference. So I'm delighted to have him cover this topic with us in this forum. AccuRev is a development tools vendor for agile and hybrid environments, and Damon has been a process expert, helping a range of companies, small companies to large companies, really adopt and good software development practices. So this is excellent to have heard Damon talk about this agile variation of Kanban and Scrum. So welcome, Damon, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Hemant. I appreciate that wonderful introduction. I'll try to live up to it. One thing I just wanted to go over quickly is in the past we did this webinar, and somebody in the audience was from a Kanban background and was basically saying, well, you know, that's really not an introduction to Kanban, and that's true. So I just want to set folks in expectations that this seminar assumes that you're either using or thinking about using Scrum, and then we're going to look at Kanban in passing to learn a little bit about how we might be able to adapt some of Kanban to Scrum. You know, myself, I'm not a Scrumite or a Kanbanite. I'm an Agilist, and I like to see, you know, what is it that I can use in my situation to adapt to what I need to do. And so I'm going to try to provide the same sort of value to you folks, which is, here are some things you might look at in your Agile adoptions. Okay, so let's start right off here. So here's, I've sort of already gone over the overview a little bit, but we'll do a bird's eye view of Scrum just to sort of get on the same page there, a brief introduction to Kanban, and then I'm going to go through 3 different categories of Scrum issues that you may or may not run into. These are sort of typical things that I've heard folks run into, and then look at how Kanban might be able to help in those situations, and we'll do the Q&A at the end. Okay, so a lot of folks doing Scrum have a Scrum Taskboard or Storyboard or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't necessarily look like this. Some have very simple ones to do, work in progress done. Some have more complicated ones. But generally, there's some sense of, I've got a backlog, I've got the things I want to do for this iteration, I have one iteration worth of work, and then I work on them, and then eventually they're done and I do it again. Right, so if we were to use a storyboard, it might look like this. Here are the stories for the iteration, and then those are set for the iteration, and the product owner may change the backlog, but for this iteration, here are the stories. And then they'll go through various stages. This is what it might look like, you know, halfway through or even towards the end of the iteration, and then eventually I get all my stories to done. That's what we hope for in Scrum. It doesn't always help. It doesn't always end up that way, but that's what we hope for. So I want to remind you folks that are doing Scrum today of, you know, what's valuable in Scrum. So here are some things that you may find valuable in Scrum. I'm sure you can think of other things that you think of as, that's why we like Scrum, that's why we're doing Scrum. There are a lot of great things about Scrum. Right? So as you look at Kanban, of course you want to keep those values that you're already finding value in, those things that you're doing that you find valuable. You want to keep those. Right? So we're not saying get rid of those or change that or anything like that. Those are all good things. Also, sometimes I've heard folks say, are you saying let's abandon Scrum and go to Kanban, or that's what they're feeling like they want to do? You know, Scrum's not working for me. Let me try something else. That's really not the idea here, right? If quote-unquote Scrum isn't working for you in general, there may be problems here that have more to do with the implementation Scrum or organizational issues. So let's not abandon Scrum for Kanban, but let's take a look at how we might fortify our existing Scrum implementation. Okay, so what is Kanban? Well, it's really just the Japanese word for signboard, right? So you might be walking down the street, you point to a signboard that says, you know, so-and-so grocers. That would be a Kanban. It's a concept that comes from lean manufacturing, and it's adapted for software. Now, sometimes folks say, oh, my goodness, right? We're not building cars. We're not doing the same thing over and over again. And that's true. Lean has been adopted by manufacturing, but lean is not a concept that is unique to manufacturing. So we're going to look at it in the software context. And one of the biggest differences between software and hardware is that in hardware, you don't want anything to change. If something changes when you're, you know, not hardware, but manufacturing. If you're building a car over and over again, you want the same car over and over again. In software, we're doing new things every time. Okay, and they were both, Lean and Scrum were influenced by Edward Deming. And the main proponents of Kanban in the software community are David Anderson, Carl Scotland, and Alan Shalloway. So those are some folks you can look up for more information specifically on Kanban. There are three main things in Kanban that we want to look at or think about, which is it's a visual system of managing work. Now, looking at this, you might think, wait a minute, you're just showing us the Scrum storyboard. It's true. Kanban says you have a storyboard, you have a task board, whatever you want to call it, that you map out your value stream. You have the work that you're going to do, the steps that you're going to do, and you show where each story or piece of work is in that overall flow. Now, that doesn't mean that you must keep testing to the end. This could look a lot like waterfall from that perspective, but it may mean that it only gets to the tested stage when you have the tests and they're running and the code is all done. So this isn't saying that you have to do them in strict order. Many extreme programming teams, for instance, will do things all at the same time. They'll write tests up front, they'll be writing code at the same time, and that's fine. Okay, so the next thought, and back on the visual, right, so this allows me to see where things are. If I've got a whole bunch of stuff that's coded but not yet tested and it starts to pile up, that's good to know. It shows me where any issues are. And really going along well with that is the idea of limited work in progress. So we're going to say, I can only have this many things in my to-do column, only this many things in my work in progress, only this many things encoded, tested, or whatever you call your stages, right? These don't have to be called these. This is just an example. So that's the second thing. And third, work is pulled through the system. Instead of pushing work and saying, I'm going to work on this next thing, you have to make space for the work first. So until I get something out of the tested column, I can't do more testing. I don't have space for it. But once I've got something off of that, for instance, in this case, done may mean, yes, it's tested, but I've also done user acceptance testing, or the product owner has signed off on it, or whatever done means to you. Maybe the final performance testing is done, or maybe you do exploratory testing, whatever it means for you. Now you have that spot. You can pull something in, and then you can pull all the way through. So the idea is that stories move from place to place, but you only move a story if you have a spot for it. All right, so that's the very quick introduction to Kanban. So here are some tools that we're going to look at today, which are helpful for the various challenges that we might see. And the three broad categories are too much work in progress, rigidity, and scaling. Okay, so let's first look at too much work in progress. So some of the problems related to that are something called mini waterfall, offset iterations, which is very popular, trying to fit stories into the iteration. You know what, we're at the end of the iteration, and we've got this one story that doesn't quite fit, or we don't have time for testing. I have nothing to test until the end of the iteration, not all stories are getting done, all kinds of things that people run into with Scrum. So let's look at the work that we need to do, the structure of the work that we need to do, whether we're doing Agile, Scrum, traditional development, whatever it is, I have to do these steps. Maybe not in this particular order, maybe not called these particular things, but something along these lines. I'm going to color code them for reference. So we've got specification, design, coding, integration, writing tests, doing user documentation. And when I refer to documentation here, I mean end user documentation, online help, manuals, that kind of stuff. And then finally, we're going to do the testing. So in any project that you're working on, you have a lot of different sizes of work, right? So I've got big things, little things. Now, if think for a moment, put on your testing cap, and here's my question to you. There are 2 tasks that you have to test this week, one of which is, and you're working on the software for a pacemaker. So one of the things that you have to test is there's a diagnostic tool which is read-only. It's not going to change anything in the pacemaker. And one screen in that diagnostic tool has a gradient that folks want to get rid of to make it easier to read. And so you need to test to see that the gradient has been removed. The other test is to make sure that the proper frequencies are being set based on input from the heart itself. Right, so we're going to change the pacemaker's algorithm, the basic algorithm. Now, which task would you focus on more during that week? Right, you're going to focus on the pacemaker, I believe. I'm sorry, the change to the algorithm, I believe, not so much the gradient. All right, you're going to check that, make sure it works. That's important, but not as important as that basic algorithm. So for any particular piece of work we're working on, we're going to say that this needs more focus, this needs less focus. We're going to do what we feel is the responsible amount of testing, the responsible amount of specification, design, all that kind of stuff, right? And that's something that we determine up front. The problem comes when any of these gets pressured to be reduced, right? That's one of the reasons we push back on waterfalls, because that testing at the end gets shrunk. And what do is if we're taking all of this test time, for instance, just picking on testing, and we total it all up, and that's the responsible amount of time that it would take to do that testing, and then we do less than that, then we are by definition being irresponsible. So the reason I'm showing you traditional development here is just to give you a sense of the overall flow of development and to remind you that even if you're doing Scrum or you're doing Agile, it may well be that there are some things that you're using around what you're doing agilely, right? So if you're just doing Agile programming, maybe you're not doing story gathering in an Agile way. Maybe you still have big upfront design and then you do the coding Agile, right? So traditional development, you do the specification. It takes a while. You create the document, right? You've got your requirements. You do the design. You pass that on as a design document from the architects, and then you start your planning. Many places that I talk to, this is where they start to be Agile. They say, all right, we've got this big master plan, then we're going to give it to the teams, and they're going to create the user stories for those teams. All right, so the flow, the Agile flow, doesn't start until this coding segment. But that's not really the idea of Agile. The idea of Agile is that you have a story starting from the customer, flowing all the way through, hopefully within the same iteration. Now, of course, you may have to do some overlapping, but as we go through this presentation, I hope you'll see that one of the ideas here is a constant flow through the system, not getting held up, right? Not the normal phase gate that we have in traditional and that we may even have wrapped around Scrum. Okay, so we have this coding phase, and the requirements change again, and then we do this big integration. Now, again, I've seen in many Agile shops that they may work in monthly iterations, and then every month the multiple teams integrate their work together. So they're doing continuous integration at the team level, but at the whole product level, they're not. But actually, continuous integration is continuous whole product integration. Unfortunately, the whole product has been silenced in that sentence, but that's really what continuous integration is integration continuously across the whole product, not once a month. Right? So that's also a problem. And then eventually we give the product to the QA folks, and they bang on it, say, why is it this way? Right? So now again, you may be asking, why am I showing traditional development? I just want to get this in your mind to be thinking about this as we go on to the next idea here. All righty. And then the requirements change again. And then we have the final products. And then we give it to the customer, and they say, "Whoa, oh, I guess they don't celebrate all that much necessarily." And then we do it all over again. All right. So now we're going to start moving into iterations in Scrum here. Let's take a look at one particular, this is still traditional actually though, let's look at one particular work item as it makes its way through this long cycle. Right, we have the specification for that particular issue that we want, or requirement, the design, the coding, the integration. It takes place over a long period of time. So think about this for a moment. Think about somebody that you know that writes code and a conversation that you had with them, or that maybe you heard about, or if you're a coder yourself, they probably wrote some code yesterday. And if you ask them how, what it was for, how it works, they could probably give you excruciating detail about that. But notice here in this example, the testing of that code happens 1, 2, 3, 4, almost 5 months after that particular thing was coded. What do you think the chances are that if that test fails and the tester asks the coder, why is it this way, that they're going to even remember that they worked on that? Right, so that's the problem. Now we're going to move into Scrum iterations here. Now let's say this iteration is 1 month. You could have that exact same pattern, right? It's going to be a shorter period of time between the coding and the testing. This may be 2 weeks, but still, 2 weeks. Imagine that the QA person finds a problem with the test and goes back to ask the person that coded it, why did you write it this way? And that person may still say, are you sure I wrote that? So as humans, it's very difficult for us to remember this kind of detail for long periods of time. And we may have a whole bunch of things that we're working on in this iteration. So if we look at any one particular issue within an iteration, and here I'm going to look at a whole bunch. If I squint here and I look at this looks awfully familiar. I've got sort of the specification phase, the sort of design phase, the sort of coding phase, and then finally the documentation and testing at the end. What does that look like? That looks to me like waterfall, just in the small. Right, so this is not what we're looking to do with Scrum. Good Scrum implementations actually naturally gravitate towards something called one-piece flow. Now, one-piece flow, or small batch size, two different names for a similar concept, comes from Lean and is a major focus of Kanban. Right, now, you can do this in Scrum as well. The idea is that what you're going to do is for any particular story you're working on, you're going to work on that story until it is done. Right? So think of a hot fix. In your organization, if there's an escalation, there's a customer down or in big trouble or data's corrupted or money's being lost or something like that, what gets in the way of fixing that problem? Nothing. Nothing gets in the way of fixing that problem because it's important. Right? And when things are really important, we try to do things the best way they could possibly be done. And what we do is actually one-piece flow. We get that one thing done. We get it. We figure out, what are we going to do? How should we do it? We do it. We write tests. We test it. Any documentation that's needed, release notes or something, we do it. We integrate it into the main product, and we ship it. That is actually the best way, minus the hair on fire, running around with like a chicken with your head cut off. Minus that part, that is the best way to develop software. You can bet that if there's a problem found in that hotfix, the coder is going to remember why he made the change the way he made it, and is going to be able to remember and think about very quickly how to fix it to make it right. So the idea here is you do everything as though it was a hotfix, minus the panic. Now, in this case, if you do this, you'll notice that I can test all the way through the iteration. I do not have to wait till the end. And if I run out of time, then the only thing that I'm doing is I may say, you know what, this story, I run out of time. I'm actually here in the timeline, right? I am not going to, I'm towards the end of the iteration. I haven't even started that story. I'm going to push it to the next iteration. That is far better than the alternative, right? Ask yourself, what would you rather have going into a new iteration? 10 stories, 80% done? Or coming into the next iteration, would you rather have 8 stories completely done and 2 not even started? Hopefully, the latter. And then there's an extreme version of this as well, which is that you're going to do all of the phases, except for specifying what you need to do, simultaneously. Right, so I'm going to do design, coding, integration, documentation, test writing, and running the tests all in parallel. Now, you might say, that sounds a little crazy. How could I possibly do that? But lots of people actually do that, and that's a major tenet of something called extreme programming. Also, test-driven design is very similar to that. All right, so what does that mean? In that case, the developer can remember what he did just recently, and it makes it a lot easier for QA and doc folks to ask questions, get their things done, because it is done and they can start their job. All right, so we can definitely apply that to Scrum. The next thing that we can apply to Scrum, there are 3 things here, is the Taskboard. Right? If you're not using a Taskboard in Scrum today, you absolutely can do that. That's very easy to do. You know, whatever states that you have in Scrum, whether it's just to do, work in progress, and done, you can put that up there and see how things are going all the way through the iteration. It's a very visible, simple way to get an overall project feeling for the project. Right? That could be in a team room where you do your stand-ups. It could be done electronically. A lot of tools like Rally, version 1, and others have this sort of functionality in there for you. So even if you're sitting at home, you can see this. And then you can just add work in progress limits. Now, unlike Kanban, you wouldn't put one on the to-do list because in Scrum, we have an iteration worth of work to do. But you could say, you know what, we're not going to start more than 3 stories at a time. We've only got 3 developers. Or even if you've got 6 developers, if you're doing pair programming, you would still only start 3. If multiple developers can work independently on a story, fine, do that. Let's say you've got 2 developers and they can each independently work on 1 story, start 1 story. So where you set these limits is up to you. Think of it a lot like a rumble strip, right? It tells you you're about to go over capacity, but if you have to go over, that's fine. It's a self-imposed limit, but it really helps to see, you know what, we have an imbalance here. The coders are creating a lot of stories that need testing, and the QA folks can't keep up. I think on this iteration, we're going to have the developers help out with test automation, start moving towards unit testing. And if you find that they're doing a lot more test automation, not just unit tests, than you had expected, maybe your ratio of code folks to QA folks is off. Maybe you need to take the developer off this team and move them to another team, and then bring in another QA person, have her start doing QA on this team, you know, whatever makes sense. But this will expose any imbalances that you have in the various skill sets and capabilities that you have on this team. And then, of course, the next thing is you can say, all right, we're going to pull work. We're only going to move work when there's space available, and that's pretty straightforward to do. Okay. So that was too much work in progress. Now we're going to go on to something that, for lack of a better term, I call rigidity. Right, so a bunch of things here that come up on planning meetings, shifting priorities, iteration gaps, choosing work so that it can all finish at the same time, right? So if you've got a team of, say, 9 folks, and you've got 3 or 4 developers on there, and you've got a bunch of QA people in there, and doc writing to do, getting everything to magically finish on the last second of the iteration can be pretty challenging. So we're going to look at 4 tools for that: decoupling, stop the line, backlog grooming, and first story time boxing. Now again, a lot of Scrum teams naturally do some of these things. They start to naturally decouple, naturally do backlog grooming, and that sort of thing, and that's great. So first off, what is an iteration gap, right? You may or may not have thought about it this way, but for any particular story, here I've got 3 developers, 3 sort of swim lanes of work here, and 2 iterations, and then in the first iteration, I've got the first developer there is working on 4 different stories, and the green stuff is stuff that can mostly be done at the start of the story, like how are we going to do this, let me write some code, and then the yellow is stuff that can mostly only be done at the end of the story, taking screenshots, final testing, whatever it is. It's going to depend on your circumstances. But you've got work, that can mostly be done at the beginning and mostly be done at the end, right? So whatever that is. So, for instance, to make it very simple, let's say that we do all our QA at the end of a story. Then the developer is going to have to leave room at the end for the QA person to actually test. And then what are they going to do? They can't start on the next story, because if they did, it couldn't be QA'd within this iteration. So you get the gap there. At the beginning of an iteration, what am I going to take screenshots of? The code hasn't been written. What am I going to start writing tests for? The code hasn't been written. I can start writing test cases, sure, but test cases. But if automation is going to take most of the time, then what am I going to be doing? So one answer to that, of course, is, well, we'll do offset iterations. But you can see that if we just got rid of the gaps, right, that's going to make things a lot better. Of course, it's difficult to do that with iterations, and I'm not saying just get rid of iterations. Let's hold on to that thought. But as I said, one of the things that folks often think of is, just going back for a moment, one of the things people often think of is, why don't I do offset iterations? So we'll have a development iteration followed by the test, an iteration of test for that, and then the developers will go on, and the QA folks will do the the next QA for the next iteration after that. That's actually an anti-pattern. That's not good for a lot of reasons. One of the simplest is that I may not get feedback on something that I did at the beginning of iteration 1 until the end of iteration 2. That's 2 whole months, and we're right back to the same problem that we had in waterfall. So while an offset iteration is better than waterfall in many cases, it has lots of problems itself, and that's not the idea. The idea is to get all the testing done within the same iteration. It's hard, I know, but that is the goal. Okay, so what can we start to do with Scrum short of just tossing out iterations? Well, there's this concept that we know in engineering called decoupling, the decoupling principle. Things that can be pulled apart should be pulled apart so that you don't have artificial dependencies that, put the kink in the works. All right, so here we've got 4-week iterations, and I've broken it up into sections of a week each. And here are the various Scrum things that we do, right? We've got to get to done, and at the beginning of each iteration, hopefully we're starting from a place that's done. If we're not, that's a whole different problem. We're going to do a retrospective on the previous iteration. We're going to do an iteration review. And I'm using the word iteration as you would use the word sprint. I tend to shy away from the word sprint because that gives folks the idea that we're doing a constant sprint, which is not the idea. We want to have a sustainable pace here. But in any case, I call it iteration. But if you want to call it sprint, that's fine. So sprint review, iteration review, same thing. Backlog grooming, right? So typical Scrum implementation, when it starts up, we're going to do maybe a day of planning, hopefully not a day, but at least a couple hours. What are we going to do in this release, this iteration? And the product owner there is saying, okay, this is the order of the backlog, all that kind of stuff. We're going to estimate out the stories, and then we're going to say, this is what we plan to do for this iteration. This is what the team accepts. Here's our goal for the sprint. Here's who's going to work on what, all that kind of stuff. Right? So those are the things we have to do at the beginning, or the state we need to be in at the beginning of each iteration. So A very simple example is if we've implemented that one-piece flow thing, which is great, or small batch size, however you want to look at it, I'm actually getting to done on an individual story basis on a regular basis. If I have some way that I can take that done story and patch it into the latest version of my software, that's exactly that. I have a patch on top of the latest version of software. I'm in a shippable place. Now, of course, I may have some processing to do at the end. I got to get the binaries together, put it up on the website, or deploy it, or all that. But I am ready to ship. I'm in a near ship position on a regular basis. So I don't need to think about done only at the end of the iteration. I can be done on a regular basis all the way through, right? So we've decoupled that from the iteration. Now, retrospective. Let me ask you a question. Think about this. I just started doing Scrum, and I've started with 1 month iterations. That seems like a comfortable starting place. How often am I going to do a retrospective on how things are going? Once a month. But I'm a new team. Now let's look at a team that's been doing it for a while, and they've got down to 1 week iterations, or 2 weeks. Let's say 1 week in this case. How often are they going to do retrospectives? Once a week. Now, who do you think, which team do you think needs that retrospective more often? Probably the new team. So the new team is doing it infrequently, and the experienced team is doing it frequently. That seems like kind of an odd impedance mismatch, doesn't it? So right there is a great example of how actually the coupling to the iterations seems exactly opposite from what you want. So what the heck? Why not do a retrospective every week, whether you're experienced or not? Another way to look at this also is you schedule the retrospective, and then you have a rule, right? You have to be careful because you don't want to skip retrospectives. You have a rule that says, when do we do retrospectives? We have it scheduled. We do it every week. We do it every month. We do it when we need it, but at least once a month. Whatever your rule is, but it does not have to be coupled to the iteration boundary. There's no reason for that. And even more extreme, you could say, you know what? I'm going to do retrospectives on a regular basis as needed. That's fantastic. But if a problem crops up, I'm not going to wait around until the iteration review. I'm going to say, stop. Let's talk about that right now. Right? I'm going to have what's called in lean, I'm going to stop the line. I'm going to pull that line, and all the cars are going to stop. We're not going to make another car until we figure this out. We're going to do root cause analysis. Why is this happening? Because why would we want to introduce more problems in our software if we have a process problem? Let's stop, take a look at it, fix it. All right. So again, we have decoupled something from that iteration boundary. So iteration review. If we look at what's the definition of a sprint or iteration review, it's let me show the customer what we've done since the previous review. So if you do those reviews whenever you want, whenever it's convenient for the customer or stakeholders, that's fine. Remember, if you're getting stories done on a regular basis, I can just say, let me review all the done stories since the last time I did a review. Right? It does not have to be coupled to the iteration. Then backlog grooming. That's something that folks naturally gravitate away from doing once per sprint, once per iteration. The product owner is constantly going through and taking all the stuff that's not in the current iteration, that's in the backlog, and saying, oh, this is more important than that, et cetera. So that when you get to that sprint planning meeting, the backlog's already groomed. It's not a question of which order should this be in. The product owner's kept that up to date. So you just skip that whole step. That's done asynchronously, which is great. You don't have that whole room of people waiting for the product owner to make up his mind. And one of the roles that I do here at AccuRev is product ownership, so I don't think I'm picking on you product owners. All right, so that can be decoupled. 2 to go. Story estimation. Again, another one that people naturally decouple when they're doing Scrum. You may or may not have been thinking about this, but in this context, this is an easy one. So what that means is that on a regular basis, the product owner or the Scrum Master is going to schedule, say, weekly story estimation meetings, and if the backlog is already groomed, just look for stories that don't have story points or hours associated, however you're doing estimation, and we estimate them. So we hold that meeting once a week. That's what we do here at AccuRev. That's what a lot of folks that I talk to naturally gravitate towards. If you've been doing Scrum for a while, I'll bet you've gravitated towards that. Again, decoupled from the iteration. No need for an iteration for that particular purpose. Lastly, iteration planning. Now, this is one of the harder ones. Right, so one of the things about iteration planning is the team and if you're not doing this, that's a whole other matter, but the team goes through and individuals pick what they're going to work on. So if we don't get together, how can we pick what we're going to work on? Good question. There's a couple of ways to handle that. One way is that if you're sitting in a team room and somebody has done their work and it's tested and it's ready to go on, they can say, hey guys, I thought I'd work on issue 1, 2, 3, 4. What do you think? And Joe says, well, that's very interesting, Frank, but issue 1, 2, 3, 4 is in Java, and I'm pretty sure that you only ever coded in C++. I think there might be a problem. Oh, you're right. Okay, can anybody help me with that? Because I'd really like to work on that, right? So you can have that whole discussion, excuse me, on an ad hoc basis. Now, if you're not in a team room, you can still do that, right? You can use IM, Skype, whatever you use, email. Say, hey, team, I'm about to work on this. What do you think? Now, maybe you guys, maybe in your organization or situation, you don't want to do that, and that's fine. That is one of the harder ones to break through. But let's say that you are working in a team room, and you could do what I suggested. Great. Then the iteration planning, as far as like who's going to do it, how many hours are left, or how many hours are for that task, can be done asynchronously. Now, there's still another problem here, which is, what about my burn down? So if my burn down is calculated based on a total number of hours remaining, and I'm doing these as I go, how could I possibly have the total hours remaining? I can't. All right, so that is an issue. But the burn down chart by itself is maybe not the best metric. Now, if I had done all these, and I'll get into that in a moment, if I had done all these, I could get rid of iterations. Now again, I'm not suggesting just, one day get rid of iterations, right? But to the degree that you can, decoupling these things is actually very beneficial, whether you, go whole hog Kanban or not. So, actually, I would say that better than a burn down is the burn up. And to have a burn up, you need to have velocity. Now, you could have the same problem as with the burn down, but the thing is, if you've picked, if you've got a velocity, let's say in this case, 20 story points, and well, let me get into the burn up in a minute. So how do I calculate velocity if I'm doing, if I have no iterations, if you get to that point? Well, what is a velocity anyway? It is the number of story points that I complete within an iteration. If your iteration is 4 weeks, then really what you're saying is, how many story points did I get done since 4 weeks ago? And you can definitely do that without iterations as well. You just say, all right, any story that was started after this point in time, if it's done by that 4 weeks, I'm going to give myself credit for however many stories are in, however many story points are in that story. And so the graph may come out differently, right? Because I have different points at which I'm measuring potentially, or I've got stories in progress. But on average, if you look at both of these charts, on average, I'm going to come out to the same velocity. So it's not exactly the most accurate measurement anyway. It's really a ballpark. So whether you're 6 of one, half dozen of the other, does it really matter if the answer comes out to about 20? I would say the answer is no. All right, so once we have our velocity calculation, we can do the burn up. And the reason burn up is better is because it's saying, am I getting stories to done, which is, as we've already said, a good emphasis anyway. And the burn down, you could have 10 stories at the end of the iteration, which are all 80% done, but stay there forever, right? So it's better to have a measurement of how many stories are done rather than how far through am I, right? You don't want to have 10 stories 80% done. You'd much rather have 8 stories 100% done at the end of the iteration. So there is another thing to be aware of here, which is, let's say now that you have gotten rid of iterations. Let's say you've gone that far. There's another danger here, which is one of the great things about Scrum is it breaks down a lot of bad habits. And one of those bad habits is having stories that go on for longer than, say, 4 weeks, right? Really long stories that really should be broken down, really large tasks that should be broken down. So Scrum is going to start breaking those bad habits, getting you into the habit of breaking down user stories, making sure that they fit within 4 weeks or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 1 week or whatever. So if you don't have iterations, right, you're missing the maximum size of a user story. So one of the invisible things in Scrum is you actually have a per story time box. You're saying if your iteration is 4 weeks, you can't have a story more than 4 weeks. So if you were to get rid of iterations, you need to keep that in mind. And the thing to do here would be to implement per story time boxing, right? So if I take all those stories from Scrum and I stand them on Edge, none of them are going to be longer than that iteration. So you want to do the same thing. Just implement a rule that says we were comfortable with 4-week iterations. We're going to make sure that no story takes longer than 4 weeks to implement. Get it done. All right, so now we're moving on to the last stage here, which is scaling. Now these techniques are not really specific to Kanban, but they show up a lot within Kanban installations or implementations, and they can easily be taken advantage of in Scrum. All right, so we're going to look at multi-stage continuous integration, the idea of team workflow, and then just plain flow in general. All right, so some of the challenges that we have here are I don't have a stable build until the end of the iteration. Right, so that one-piece flow is all well and good, but if everything's being checked into the main line, I still have, potentially a big mess there. Integrating with other teams and the always good question, who wrote the build? So let's go back and take a look at our storyboard. And we've got the team here, and we've got a backlog. We figured out what we're going to do for this iteration, and they're at some point on these various stories in the iteration. So if we think of these various stages in our iteration as branches or streams, we could do something interesting. Now, when I say branch or stream, you might say, oh, gosh, branches. Gee, I don't know. I'm not sure that's for me. I think those are bad things, and I got to merge and all that kind of stuff. Okay, I'm not talking about, the kind of branching where you put off merging for a long period of time, and then you've got, this merge hell. I'm talking about something different. What I'm saying is, right, if we have this process and we're using branches and streams, we can move things rapidly through this gauntlet, right? Continuous integration at each stage. If I have a branch, that means I can check out code from there and do continuous integration. And I can have different criteria for each of those stages. I can say that the only way that I can move a story to coded is if the story has a status of it's coded, right? That means I have, as a developer, decided that I believe all the work is done and it is ready to be considered for final testing, right? It's not something that I'm just, futzing around with, may have some more changes. I believe it's done. That doesn't mean that it is done, but at least I believe it's done. So if I have that criteria, then why should it move out of the work in progress branch, if it's broken? Right? So I can do some continuous integration there, and if it works, great. I'm going to merge it onto the coded branch, and then I may have stricter criteria for the next thing. It may be that there are tests attached to that story, and they've been run on the build from that coded stream or branch, and they all pass. Right? So the only thing that's going to get to the tested branch here is stuff that the code is complete. A test plan has been written. The tests are implemented either through automation, or I've got a QA person standing by ready to run them, and or I had a QA person go through the test plan and do the tests, and they all pass. Great. And then the same thing for the final phase. Maybe the criteria that you have for done is that I've showed it to a user, they like it, or I've shown it to the product owner, they liked it, and we did exploratory testing, and we tried it out on our QA instance or something like that. Whatever your criteria are, and then the benefit that you get from this is the ability to do that one-piece flow to help, to help the tool stack enforce that. And what you can do now is imagine you're a doc person, you're a QA person, or you're a product owner. If I want to show somebody something, or I want to test something specifically, or I want to get a screenshot or write documentation for that story, why should I be working on the main line that's got all kinds of stuff that isn't even finished coding, that's just work in progress, doesn't have tests attached, the test don't pass? I want to build from my CI server that's linked to the tested stream that only has tested stories in it. So imagine you're going to test a build, and you go to log in, and it fails. Why? Because there was somebody making a change to the login code for a new story that hasn't even been finished yet, let alone having tests attached or tests written or run. Right? So this allows you to have those multiple stages and allows you to easily do the one-piece flow. So multiple team coordination is the next thing I want to look into here. What a lot of advanced large program Scrum companies do that I see, for instance, I've talked to folks that have 40 Scrum teams and even 80 Scrum teams. In this case, I'm just going to show you 4, is they set up continuous integration for each team, as I was saying before, but they also integrate on a regular basis with other teams, right? So I've got my backlog, my team backlog, stuff comes in. When the team has it working, when the team gets it done, which might be in the first day, any particular story, or in the second day or the third day, or whenever that story is done, I'm going to try to integrate it at the next level so that the other team can have feedback on whether or not anything they've done is broken as soon as possible, right? Because it's not really done if I haven't integrated it with the other team if I'm working with another team. So you can have an even stricter definition of done, which is I've got multiple teams here, in this case 2, that it's integrated with the work that they have done. And if you have 4 teams or more teams, you may have multiple levels of integration. Now this may start to sound a little, like a lot of work, but the thing is, you're doing all this work anyway. It's just that you've crammed it all into the main line, right? So this is pulling it apart and saying there's integration work that we need to do at the team level because you and I are on the same team. We should integrate with each other first before we integrate with everybody else, because you know what? If I integrate with your code and it doesn't even work, why should everybody else have to pay for that and think that it's their problem? But if we integrate on our own branch or stream and it doesn't work, then we know it's either you or me, and we fix our problem first before sharing it with everybody else. So now the other idea here is that the flow is not slow here. We want this going through as fast as we possibly can. And Kanban is really well suited to this, especially the one-piece flow, because I've got stuff to done all the way through my iteration. So it's easier for me to integrate with other teams because I have a small piece of something done that I can integrate with the whole product, and it's going to look a little bit like this. So I've got product management talking to the customer or multiple customers. That story, which represents some business value, whether it's saving whales or making money or something charitable, something else charitable, I've got those stories coming in for what I need to do, going into the master backlog, being prioritized, and whatever's at the top of that backlog is going to go to the appropriate team and go into their backlog. That team is going to work on the work from their backlog, top down. They're going to put it through that, they're going to work on it with limited work in progress. They're going to get stories done on a regular basis, following one-piece flow, get it done. When it's done, they're going to integrate it with other teams. And then when that works with whatever teams that they're working with, they're going to integrate it at the whole product level. And that flow is going to be much more rapid. We're not talking months and months here. A story could flow from the left to the right and be ready to give to a customer as part of a whole product within days. But if it runs into a snag at any point in this flow, of course it should stop and you work on it. But it doesn't hinder everybody else. So think about it this way. You go to the bank or you go to the store or you go to the airport, and there's four lines, there's one line that's served by one clerk, right? So if something goes wrong, the whole line is held back. What's better is to have multiple flow points here, just like this. So if there's a problem with one team, it's not holding up the whole product, right? Same exact idea. All right. Now, what do you need to do to accomplish this? Well, of course, you're going to need something for Agile Lifecycle management, right? So if you don't have anything that's managing user stories and backlogs, you're going to need something like that. And we happen to offer that as part of our suite called Agile Cycle. And one piece of that is the Agile Project Management, which is powered by Rally. Then, of course, you're going to need change-aware SCM support. What that means is you're going to need an SCM system that understands backlogs and teams and continuous integration, and that makes that flow that I was showing you earlier very possible. You don't want something that is going to be very hard to do merging and branching and have that continuous flow and developers getting upset. You don't want that, right? So AccuRev is the Agile SCM tool that helps enable that underneath. And then on top of that, of course, you're going to need continuous integration. And what we offer is something called Anthill Pro. Now, we also integrate with other tools. So if you want to use version 1 or you want to use cruise control, that's fine. We'll work with those as well. But we sell all three together as part of an overall package called Agile Cycle with integrations, both in the server side and on the front end, with metrics to allow you to see how things are going. In support of that, we also have, besides the tooling, we also have Scrum team user training, which we can come on site. We have some public courses coming up in Atlanta, Phoenix, and LA in mid-April, and we also have an Agile Success Workshop. So contact us at agilecycle.com for more information on that. And I'd like to turn it back over to Hemant. Hemant?
Great. Thank you, Damon. This is excellent coverage of the Scrum and Kanban topic. So audience, now there's the time for you to reflect upon what Damon just covered. And we already have some questions in the panel here, in my Q&A panel on the webinar mechanism. And if you guys can think more, while you're thinking about how this applies and adding your questions, I will take a few minutes and introduce Synerzip to you, and then we'll come back, take a few questions that have come in. Okay. So let me make sure you can actually see my screen. Give me a minute. I'm assuming you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Great. So Synerzip in a nutshell, just to take a couple of minutes, and we are a software development partner for small to mid-sized technology companies. We serve as a extension of their in-house engineering team, and we stay domain and technology agnostic and help our clients really expand and scale their R&D teams. That's the most important part of what we do as a company. For each client, we have a dedicated team, like I just mentioned, but it is not a staff augmentation kind of a model. We are very involved with the clients and making sure they're actually getting the value of software development. We have a lot of experience with software development going back to the management team about 30 years. So with that experience and our belief around Agile as a general philosophy, as an excellent way to build quality software and deliver value, we are able to really reduce the risk for our clients and strike the right level of discipline. Too much discipline, you choke the innovation of software development, and too little discipline, you run into quality and delivery issues. So striking the right balance in the spirit of Agile is what we help our clients do and follow what is the right balance for them. The fourth point about Synerzip is we help significantly reduce the development cost. We have a dual shore team, a development center in India, and a small product owner and product management team on the US side. So for each of our clients, we have those two components covered, and we are able to provide a 50% cost advantage to our clients. The last point is the control and flexibility that we offer to our clients. Many of our clients value the fact that they have dedicated team with Synerzip, and down the line, if they wanted to create their own India operation, they could convert that team into their own, and we allow and facilitate that process. So that gives our clients a lot of flexibility long term. So in the short term, they can scale their R&D with reduced cost and high degree of value, and long term, they can really convert it into their own operation if they need it to. And like I said, next page just covers a sample of our customers. Almost all are small to mid-sized technology companies. We feel we are a good fit to serve them, and this just gives you a glimpse of those. So with that, let me turn over to the Q&A part of this webinar now. So we have a number of questions in here. I'll have to have a tough job, Damon, to pick a few questions that will do justice to the broader audience. And for any further discussion, we can obviously go offline with any of you guys on the audience. So let's take the first question, Damon. So the first one is on applicability of what we just discussed. Various agile techniques are followed, XP, Scrum, and then we discussed Kanban today, how that fits. Are there certain characteristics of development software development projects where Kanban is far more fit and suitable than perhaps Scrum has been?
Okay, sure. I think all these agile techniques have sort of places where they start out, where they are currently the most well-tuned and that sort of thing. And so I would say that at a very high level, Kanban is fairly new, right? So if you were to go whole hog Kanban, you would be sort of on the leading edge there, right? So you wouldn't be able to look too much outside of your own organization and experience for help. Now, of course, there are folks out there that provide consulting on Kanban specifically, and there are some books coming out and that sort of thing, but it is fairly new, and to some extent, it's mostly for the adventurous. On the other side of that, though, and this is the reason that I focus on taking pieces from Kanban, there are a lot of folks doing Scrum and that are far enough along that they feel pretty comfortable with what they're doing and are just looking for new things. So that's really sort of at the high level the way I look at it. Now, to get right to the question itself, Kanban itself, if you were to practice it purely and not be doing the thing that I'm suggesting, which is to adapt things from it, started out mostly for sort of maintenance projects and IT service desks where somebody's saying, hey, I'm using the software internally and I've got a bug here, or I need to add a field there, or something like that. Smaller requests that come in on a regular basis. And one of the issues with that is if you're providing sort of an internal service from a software perspective, folks aren't going to wait for you to say, oh, I now have enough for an iteration. I've now got my backlog, and we're doing a 1-month sprint, and you can wait. Folks are going to come back and say, well, why can't you update that right now? You said it was a day of work. Why not do it now? Right? So Kanban is great for that sort of thing, and that's really where it started out. That said, a lot of folks now are realizing that you can use it for new product development. You can do it for whether it's in-house or you have lots of customers. We've started to use it here at AccuRev, and we're piloting it out, and it's going very well. We've got it on one project so far, and it's for new development, and that's working very well. We're about to start it on a whole new product, and that's very exciting, and we're going to use Kanban on that as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's take another question, which is you talked about one of the key ingredients of Kanban is the WIP limits, which is putting a certain limit to each stage of the Kanban. So first thing, how do you arrive at appropriate limit in each situation? And second thing is there expectation? How much is the expectation of cross-skilled team members to get a QA jumping into development or developers jumping into QA in case the bottleneck ends up being on the QA side and vice versa?
Okay, so that's kind of a two-parter there, I guess, which is the first one is the easiest, I guess, which is how do I set up the work in progress limit? So really that's sort of, you just play it by ear, really. So if you find that you have, let's say, 10 stories in general in an iteration, you might say, well, it doesn't make sense to have all 10 in testing, right? So 10 is right out. But to have only 1 in testing, that's probably too few. You know what? Let's start it at 5, right? Because if it's over 5, that means, we've got half of everything for this iteration in testing. That's too much, right? So you might start out very conservative and then find that when you're at 5, still you've got developers, basically idle with nothing to do. And so you might say, all right, let's drop it down to 4, and then finally down to 3, and then say, you know what, that's pretty good. If we did it, any lower than that, that would be too low. So really, it's something that depends on your circumstances, and you may find that, for instance, the test writing goes twice as fast as the code writing, and so you have a work in progress limit for, starting new stories of 4, and a work in progress limit of how much can be in test of only 2. So it really depends on the circumstances. Generally what I find is people adapt to it pretty rapidly. I saw a presentation once where they showed 9 months of Kanban boards and pretty much every week they had a different set of columns and work in progress limits until finally after about 9 months they settled down on something that worked for them. But they learned so much and they changed their process so much, there was a lot of value there for them. And then the second question is, what about load balancing? You know, how can are you really saying that QA people should bounce around to development and development should do QA and that sort of thing? Absolutely, right? So one of the things in Agile, one of the engineering techniques is unit tests. You may find that you have a lot of testing that's done at the integration level or the the UI that really ought to be at the unit level, right? So if you have a test which starts up a new database, loads the schema, starts up the product, logs in, gets new values in the database, and then calls something, and then at the end of the day is just adding 2 plus 2, well, that should be a unit test, right? So the more of that you can move over to unit testing, the more load that you're going to take off the GUI automation from the QA folks, and the more they're going to be able to up their capacity, right? So that's just one example.
Okay, excellent. Looks like we could have taken more questions, but we run out of time. So as usual, I thank you very much, Damon, for being the featured speaker in today's webinar. This was excellent coverage of this topic, and thank you all for participating.
Okay, you're very welcome, Hemant.
And we'll reconvene next month for another webinar. Thanks, course. With that, we close this webinar today.
All right, well, thanks to everybody for your